The Stephanie Lazarus case, the LAPD, officer who murdered her rival and worked alongside the detectives, hunting her for 23 years. What would you do if the person who committed a murder, a brutal, premeditated killing, kept showing up to work every single day at the police department investigating that very murder? What if, while detectives built case files, interviewed witnesses, and chased down dead-end leads, the killer was just down the hall, sipping coffee, putting on a badge, and answering calls for service? This isn't a thriller novel. This isn't a Netflix series premise. This is a true story. And for over 2 decades, it played out inside one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the United States. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus. She was an LAPD detective. And for 23 years, she got away with murder, not by hiding in the shadows, but by hiding in plain sight. To understand this story, you need to know Sherri Rasmussen. Sherri was, by every account, the kind of person who lit up a room. Born in 1958 in Tucson, Arizona, she studied nursing and eventually became the director of critical care. Nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center in Los Angeles, she was talented, ambitious, and deeply loved by her family and colleagues. In November 1985, Sherri married the man she'd been dating for several years, a soft-spoken engineer named John Retton. By all accounts, it was a happy union. The couple moved into a condo in Van Nuys and the future looked bright. But not everyone was happy about the wedding. John Retton had an ex-girlfriend, someone who hadn't quite let go, someone who had reportedly shown up at Sherri's workplace more than once, confronting her, warning her to back off. Someone who had told Sherri in no uncertain terms that she believed John still belonged to her. That someone was Stephanie Lazarus, an officer with the Los Angeles Police Department. Sherri had even told her father about the harassment. She was frightened. She didn't know how far this woman would go. She would find out on February 24th, 1986. It was a Monday morning. John had already left for work. Sherri was home alone. Sometime during that day, an intruder entered their condo. What followed was a prolonged, violent struggle. The scene investigators would later describe was not the work of a random burglar. It was a fight to the death. Furniture was knocked over. Blood was found throughout multiple rooms. Sherri had defensive wounds. She had been shot twice with a .38 caliber revolver, and she had a human bite mark on her arm, left by her killer in the chaos. When John came home that evening, he found his wife dead on the living room floor. The responding officers concluded it was a burglary gone wrong. A CD player and a VCR had been taken. But Sherri's father, Nuys Rasmussen, didn't believe it for a second. He told investigators, "Look at John's ex-girlfriend, the one who had been harassing Sherri, the cop." The lead detective made a note of the name and then did almost nothing with it. In the notes from the original investigation, the name Stephanie Lazarus appears exactly once. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Lazarus went back to work. For years, the case sat cold. The LAPD in the late 1980s was overwhelmed. The crack epidemic had exploded. Gang violence was surging. Sherri Rasmussen's case was one homicide among hundreds, and without a clear suspect, it slipped further and further down the pile. But there was one detail that had never been properly followed up on. One piece of physical evidence that pointed away from the burglar theory entirely: the bite mark. In 2004, a criminalist named Jennifer Francis tracked down a cotton swab from the original crime scene, a swab containing DNA from the bite mark on Sherri's arm. When it was analyzed, the results came back surprising. The DNA profile was female, not a male burglar, a woman. This should have cracked the case open immediately, but again, no detective picked it up. The lead went cold. By this point, Stephanie Lazarus had risen through the LAPD ranks. She was no longer a patrol officer. She was now a detective, working in the department's art theft unit. The same building, the same institution that housed the cold case unit slowly working on her victim's file. She passed colleagues in the hallway. She attended department meetings. She was, in every professional sense, one of them, and nobody suspected a thing. Everything changed in 2009. A detective named Jim Nuttall from the Van Nuys division was assigned to take a fresh look at the Rasmussen case. He did something remarkably simple, something none of his predecessors had apparently done in 23 years. He actually called John Rutan and sat down with him. In that conversation, Rutan mentioned something that made Nuttall's spine go cold. He said he had actually given investigators a name back in 1986, right after Sherri's murder, a name he assumed they had followed up on. The name of his ex-girlfriend, an LAPD officer who had been obsessed with him, who had harassed Sherri, who had access to firearms, Stephanie Lazarus. Nuttall found the single mention of her name in the original file. It had never been pursued. No one had ever interviewed her. No one had ever collected her DNA for comparison. Now they needed to do that quietly, because Stephanie Lazarus was still on the force. If she got wind of the investigation, she might run, destroy evidence, or worse. The LAPD surveillance unit was assigned to follow her without her knowledge. One afternoon, they watched as she threw a paper cup into a public trash can. They retrieved it. The DNA from the cup was sent to the lab, where it was compared to the profile from the bite mark on Sherri Rasmussen's arm, the bite mark left by her killer 23 years earlier. It was a match. Stephanie Lazarus, LAPD detective, 25-year veteran, the woman who had worked in the same building as the people hunting Sherri Rasmussen's killer, was that killer. On June 5, 2009, detectives brought Lazarus in for what they framed as a routine interview. They didn't tell her why. They didn't want to spook her. She walked into the interview room relaxed, professional, cooperative. She was a detective. She knew how these interviews went. She thought she was in control. What she didn't know was that the room was wired. Everything she said was being recorded. Investigators already had the DNA match. They were just watching her, watching how a killer behaves when she thinks she's finally safe. At first, she played it perfectly. She acknowledged knowing John Retton. She acknowledged the relationship. She acknowledged there might have been some friction with Sherri, but she denied everything else. Then the detectives shifted, and they showed her what they had. The interview broke down. Lazarus was arrested right there in the building where she had worked for nearly 3 decades. Her colleagues on the LAPD were stunned. Many of them had known her for years. Some called her a mentor. Others said they never would have suspected her in a million years. That was, of course, exactly why she had gotten away with it for so long. In 2012, Stephanie Lazarus stood trial for the first-degree murder of Sherri Rasmussen. The jury took only 6 hours to convict her. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. She appealed the conviction multiple times. As of this recording, she remains behind bars. For Sherri Rasmussen's parents, the verdict came 26 years too late, but it came. Nuys Rasmussen had never stopped pressing for answers. He had told police from the very beginning who he believed was responsible. Nobody had listened. The case exposed a profound institutional blind spot. Law enforcement can be deeply reluctant to investigate its own. The note with Lazarus's name had sat in a file for over 2 decades. It took one detective asking the right question to unravel everything. And the man Lazarus had been obsessed with, John Rutan, had unknowingly provided her name to investigators just 2 weeks after his wife's murder. He had assumed they followed up. They hadn't. That gap, that failure, cost Sherri Rasmussen 23 years of justice. There's something deeply unsettling about this case that goes beyond the crime itself. Stephanie Lazarus didn't hide in a cabin in the woods. She didn't flee the country. She walked into work the day after she killed Sherri Rasmussen, and the day after that, and the day after that, for over 2 decades, surrounded by the very people tasked with finding the truth. The safest place to hide a secret, it turns out, isn't always in the dark. Sometimes it's right under the light.